Hi, this is Mark Farn, and welcome to another Every Believer Confident podcast. And I have with me today our research assistant, Jeff Mindler. And today we are talking about, or trying to answer the question, is the world religious? Are people religious? We hear a lot about the secularization of the world and the idea that people are no longer religious, no longer interested in religion. Mm-hmm. And is that really true? And we're looking at an article today by James Eglinton, who teaches at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And he's written an article that basically argues that the world is unmistakably, unchangeably religious. Mm-hmm. And how does that fly in the face of what we tend to think of in the West, Jeff?
Yeah, well, what we commonly hear from people of a variety of stripes, whether it be agnostic, atheists, or just concerned Christians, is that the world is increasingly becoming secular. And the decline of religion in general is something that people often talk about. So it's a very important subject to address and to ask, like, okay, is this actually the case? Are we in the West, or just in the world in general, are we becoming more secular, and is religion dying? And I think Dr. Eglinton makes a very compelling case that we are not, in fact, becoming more secular, that, as we'll dive into, man is inherently religious, and He cannot escape that.
Yeah. He makes a great distinction between people, who we say people are religious. We can't help but be, because we're made in the image of God. We are made to worship. Mm-hmm. And therefore we will worship something. And he talks about the difference between people and religious consciousness or political consciousness. And he does say in the West, and West is United States, Canada, Western Europe, mm-hmm. Australia, we have a much more secularizing culture. And secularism is essentially pushing God to the margins of life, where it's not a total denial of God or rejection of God like under communism, mm-hmm. but rather is this idea that God only exists in the margins of my life. Eglinton does acknowledge that for the last 100 or 200 years in the West, there has been that influence. But while that has been happening culturally and politically, people themselves are irretrievably religious. Mm-hmm. And he makes this statement. Let me know what you think about this. He says, we can say, and he's quoting J.H. Bavinck, the great missiologist. He said, we can say every person seeks God, and we can also say there is no one who seeks God. Mm. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally, so he's drawing on, particularly in that second half, no one seeks for God. I mean, Paul's very clear about that in the Romans chapters 1-3. But in that first part, everyone seeks for God that they make in their own image, whether it's themselves or whatever they worship. But it's the true and living God that is revealed to us in general revelation and special revelation. That is the God whom they do not seek.
Yes.
So everyone seeks to be a God unto themselves, or make a God in their own image, but the true and living God they do not seek after.
So if everyone is religious, what would we say about those people who do not worship the true God, the triune God? Yeah. What can we say about them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say what Scripture says in a large part is they're suppressing the truth in mm-hmm. unrighteousness. They are at enmity or rebellion with the true and living God, and God's revelation of himself that we see in creation, in themselves as made in his image, is, like you said, irreducibly, I mean, it's there. You can't escape it. Mm-hmm. And so while they may not worship the true and living God, they will worship something.
Which makes them, I'm looking for a particular word, idolaters.
Idolaters, yeah.
Yes. When we talk about world religion and atheism and secularism, you either transfer your worship of God, if you reject the God of Scripture, to another religion. And so you overtly worship as a Muslim, as a Buddhist, even though Buddhists don't have a God, there's still the worship of. enlightenment and the mind and all that. Hinduism, any of the cults, Judaism, or you worship something intangible and less overtly religious, but it's still religious.
Yeah.
Money, power, sex, success,
Yep.
fame, the mind.
Health and wealth.
Health and wealth. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Think about every person is irreducibly religious. That is at their core, because again, as Christians, we believe God made us to worship. So we're going to worship something. Everyone worships, even as the agnostic American novelist David Foster Wallace said, there's no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everyone worships something. So we live in a world, while the cultural and political structure of our world seeks to be secular, remove religion overtly, as human beings, we cannot help but be religious.
Yeah. And this goes to one of the, point of contact with the unbeliever as we're seeking to engage them with the gospel. And evangelistically and apologetically is that criteria of, is this livable?
Yes.
And the atheist, that they say out of their mouth that they don't believe or they're not religious. But then when you look at the way they live, you can oftentimes find out where they are placing their value, their trust, their idolatry,
Yes.
to use that word. So it's consistent atheism is unlivable.
That's right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah, I get together with unbelievers every week, and it becomes increasingly clear over time what they're worshiping. Sometimes it's not always obvious to tell, because some of them don't seem to worship anything, but the more you get to know them, they worship reason, they worship science, they worship themselves. Yes, there's so many things, but they're worshiping something. And Tim Keller is helpful in this area. Worship is that which you find your significance in. Worship is that which explains the world to you. And worship is an idol that we worship is that which, if taken away from us, would make life feel like it wasn't worth living. So that's if you think of worship that way, and not kneeling or bowing down, but rather I find my significance in this. I find my identity in this. This explains and defines reality for me. Without this, the world would seem like it's not worth living. Everyone has something about that.
And that could perhaps explain something you mentioned there, could explain why a lot of people think that religion is dying, because they may not see, the person bowing down and performing what they would think are overtly religious rituals or rites or those types of things. But once you realize that worship or religion is not limited to those expressions, and that someone's worship of money might cause them to work 80 to 100 hours every week so they can get more and more and more of it. Well, that's they're doing that as an expression of what they find ultimate meaning and value in. And so it's just a matter of, the religious practice just looks a little different, but it's still religious.
It's good. So let's think about, before we get back to the article, which I want to say more about, let's think about different ways, different types of people worship. You mentioned, for example, someone who their life is all about accomplishment, achievement, financial security, wealth. Their worship is their workaholism, their overwork, their constantly striving. That's the sacrifice they make to their God of success in order to achieve that. What about someone who refuses to work? What might their God be? What are they worshiping?
I mean, in that case, it seems like they're worshiping the God of either convenience or laziness or just comfortability, maybe. Yep. They Proverbs talks about the sluggard who can't even, bring his hand up to his mouth with food in it. And so they could be worshiping their own comfort, their own ease of life.
That's
perhaps.
right. Someone who says, I don't want to work and I want other people to support my life. That's what essentially welfare is. And we acknowledge that there might be a place for that for people in crisis. But increasingly, there's people who just say, I will never work and I have no desire to work and I'll let other people provide for me. Yeah, comfort, convenience, the fulfillment of their own desires.
Yeah.
Think about people who eat themselves to death, become morbidly obese. That is an idolization of my desires.
Yeah.
When I feel hungry, I must feed myself and I must satisfy my taste with something good. And as the New Testament says, their God is their belly.
Yeah.
In other words, their God is their physical desire.
Yeah.
Same with someone who is addicted to sexual stimulation of any kind. That is their God, and they make the sacrifice to their God. Wellness. I'm not against being well, but wellness can be an idol.
Yeah.
Where I am striving for a certain level of fitness or beauty or trying to overcome my mortality.
Yeah.
And that becomes my God and my identity. You know, what size I am, what do I fit into, how do I look?
And you can see the rituals of you constantly looking at yourself to make sure
posting selfies
that I'm good, or even getting to the point where people are injecting things into their body to try to make it look more youthful.
Yeah.
How is that not some type of religious practice, that a sacrament in that regard that you are?
A total sacrament, yes. Let me have surgery to alter my face so that I look younger. Or, you know, there's things like calf implants for those who want more muscular looking calves. And I mean, we could go to the ridiculous ends. I know people that worship thrills. So their life is filled with
the adrenaline junkies.
Yes, hobbies and adrenaline junkies. And for others, it is, I want people to respect me. So I will always project this image of intelligence and having it together, having my life in, you know, the way I want it to be. There's so many ways, so many idols that we can develop in our lives in rejection of God. And I find increasingly the people that I know that aren't believers, ultimately their God is their own autonomy, their own authority.
Yeah.
At the root of their rejection of Christianity, some that I know, is I will not allow anyone to be in authority over me, especially God. I will be the God of my own life. I will be the captain of my soul.
Yeah, yeah.
Jeff, also in this article, James Eglinton talks about the Patmos Initiative and the Bible Society's Quiet Revival. Both of these studies talk about the fact that other than a very few minority of countries, most countries are becoming increasingly religious. And what was the one country that he said showed some measure of decrease in religiosity?
I believe it was Portugal. That was
Portugal.
The only country that was showing a decline in religiosity, but every other major country they looked at is seeing an increase.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. If we measure this as the way people live their lives, finding their identity in something, if that's worship, then that is always going to be present, even if the culture rises or falls with religiosity.
Yeah, and he roots a lot of this in, if we're thinking biblically and theologically in those categories, he roots a lot of this in the image of God, that man as being made in God's image. Part of what that entails is what, he's not the first to say that. I mean, Calvin mentioned the implanted knowledge that is there by virtue of us being created in God's image, that the seed of religion, as Calvin calls it, or the sense of divine, the sense of divinity, that people, by their very nature of what they are as made in his image, will worship something. And Paul says, Romans 1, that they will, apart from God, they suppress that truth, and they turn and worship the creation rather than the creator.
That's right. So practically, how does this help us in apologetics?
I think there's several points. So one thing that it helps us to do is when we're talking with somebody or we approach somebody, we actually know a few things about them. We know they're made in God's image, that God's revelation has gotten through to them, both in the things that are made and in their own constitution as being made in his image. God's revelation is there. And if they are an unbeliever, that they're suppressing that, and they are inherently religious or worshipers. So we know, okay, if they're exchanging the truth of God for a lie and worshiping and serving the creation rather than the creator, we can try to spot and look for, okay, where is that suppression of the truth manifesting itself and showing itself?
That's right. And a really good resource for this is Daniel Strange's book, Making Faith Magnetic, 5 Hidden Themes Our Culture Can't Stop Talking About, and how to connect them to Christ. Strange, and Eglinton talks about this in the article as well, that even if people claim to have no religion and claim not to worship something, they still have what he calls these this sense of the divine, a suppressed sense of the divine, which leaves behind an equally vague and powerful sense that there is something needed to explain life. And Dan Strange does a great job of showing the worldview questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? What is the reality of life? What is meaning? Is there something out there? How do we know the difference between right and wrong? Everyone thinks about these things. And these are religious questions, because as Christians, we tie the answer to all these back to God. But an unbeliever who rejects the Christian faith has to connect them to something else. And that's something you can ask people. These are the kind of questions you can ask them. Is there something out there? Where do we find our sense of right and wrong? What's wrong with the world? What would make it better? Everyone thinks about these things. Everyone has an opinion on these things. And these are openings into apologetic conversations that can lead to the gospel.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for wrestling with this issue with us. While we may seem to live in an irreligious world, it is irretrievably, irreducibly, unmistakably religious, and we can use that in apologetics to open the door to conversations to the gospel. If you enjoyed this video and would like to find more resources on apologetics, go to apologeticsforthechurch.org.